Hey guys, my name is Elias. Welcome back to the channel. If you like car content like me, go ahead and hit that button to subscribe down below. Now today, as you can see, I have a couple of engine bays open because we're going to talk about a topic that I've been getting a ton of questions on, and that's engine tuning. So let's go ahead and talk about what those tools are, what our options are, the benefits, and the cons to each tool. So you decided to tune your car, but you don't know where to start. So let's get started with at least the options that you have available for most of our cars. Now there's basically three options available to tune our cars that are mainstream. First one is a standalone tune. Now what that means is that there's a standalone ECU that you buy and you replace your stock ECU with this standalone ECU. You can then use that standalone ECU and drop in tunes as you'd like. The other type of tune is, of course, an OBD2 type of tune or a reflash type of tune where your stock ECU gets cracked, which means the encryption on it gets cracked, and you could get it through the encryption on the ECU. Somebody or a tuning company takes that software and they write it to a program, and then they tune the cars depending on what you want, different parameters. There's, fuel, AFR, turbo boost, etc. And then of course the third tuning option, the piggyback tune. Now what a piggyback tune is a separate module usually that connects on top of or next to your ECU. What it does is it intercepts signals from the sensors all around the engine and tricks the ECU into basically giving you more power. Now let's go through all three and take a look at the benefits and the cons. So we're starting out with Type R because currently there are only two real options available to the Type R, and that's either a standalone ECU or a piggyback tune. So we're going to talk about the standalone ECU option currently available for the Type R. So right now you can go on VidTune's website, and for $4,500 you can get the Motec ECU tuned by VidTune himself, and you can put out 400 or close to 400 wheel horsepower. Now how does that work? Well, let's take a look. So tuning the Type R has been a bit of a tricky job ever since it's been released, and that's because Honda has decided to use a very different ECU than it's used on the other Civic models. So the ECU is right here. Let me show you. Now to get access to the ECU is actually very simple. You just pop open these tabs like so, and there it is. There's the ECU. Now be very careful not to get this area wet. It's very important you keep this area dry. Well, this is the Bosch ECU. This is the heart of the whole engine management system. As you can see, all the wires lead to here. So how does this Motec standalone ECU work? Well, basically you take off the ECU. I'm not doing it for my car, but you take it off, you pop it off, and you would pop on the Motec ECU. Now, as you can see, all these wire harnesses need to be basically cut and spliced into the Motec ECU. So while, yes, you're replacing your stock ECU with the Motec one, it wouldn't be an easy job to just swap back and forth, at least not yet. I'm sure VidTune's probably working on a system where you'd be able to just plug in all the wires into a harness that you could plug into the Motec, and if you want to unplug it and replace the original ECU, you can do that. But for now, you'd have to splice in the ECU through the wires. That's how I've seen it anyway. He could have already managed to figure out an option on how not to do that. Well, the reason you have to do this is because this unit has been impossible to crack for a lot of the small tuners. I'm talking about Honda and K-Tuner. Now, I've heard that Honda and K-Tuner have been able to at least read the ECU and they know what tune is on there, but I'm not sure they've been able to write back to the ECU. In order to flash the tune, you need to be able to write back on there. So with the Motec ECU, you could plug it in here, and the Motec ECU is easy to go ahead and tune. So VidTune has been able to push out a few different tunes to the Type R that have been really good, and if you want to check those out, go ahead. So now let's talk about the second option for tuning your ECU, and that's the reflash. Now there's actually two ways that you can get your ECU reflash. The first way, of course, is to take your ECU out, put it in a box, and send it over to a tuning company to reflash your ECU. Now what that does is it basically takes your stock ECU, like the one I showed you in the Type R, they take it, put it on a bench, connect it to a computer, and they remap the software on that ECU to give it different options. You could increase their turbocharger pressure, you could increase AFR, you could tweak it, you can increase fuel, you can increase different parameters to make your vehicle better or worse, depending on how good the tuner is. Now, of course, there's tons of companies out there doing this type of tuning if the ECU has been cracked. Unfortunately for the Type R, it hasn't been cracked yet. Now, with the 335D, a company called Beamer Performance Center down in Georgia is bundling basically a tuning, I would say a tuning package that you send them over an ECU. They send you over a few parts, you replace those parts on this car, they tune your ECU according to those parts, and you get basically 600 foot-pounds of torque and 400 horsepower. This is what this car has, which is really cool. Now, they are starting to offer standalone little computers that can actually reflash your ECU at will. And that's really cool. And that's similar actually to this K-Tuner right here, K-Tuner Flash V2. Now, in case you don't know what that is, this is actually made for the Civics, for Acuras, etc. And this is what it looks like. So obviously, since this is a K-Tuner, it doesn't work with the Beamer. But it's the same, it's a similar process to flashing the ECU on this. But instead of sending it out, you can actually plug this into your OBD2 port, and this will read the map from the ECU, and you can remap it according to whatever you'd like. Now, what I like about these tuners right here is that they come with 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 base maps, and what those base maps are basically safe tunes that you can put on any car depending on the modifications you have to it. You know, there's stage 1, there's stage 2, there's stage 3, I've seen stage 4s. And with this tuner, you could change your tune whenever you'd like, as often as you'd like. Now, of course, the main difference between a reflash and a standalone ECU is that you're keeping your stock ECU in your car. So usually it's a lot less expensive. If I had a Civic Si or a Civic Hatchback Sport still with that K-Tuner V2, which costs around 500, 600 bucks, I can reflash my ECU at will. You know, I can actually use the base maps like I talked to you about, or I can get somebody like VidTune to give me one of their special tunes depending on the modifications that I have on the car. This is, like I said, my favorite way to tune a car, and the main reasons are that it's very modifiable. You could reflash it back to stock whenever you'd like. You're using the stock ECU, so you're not changing anything up, you're just reflashing the software, which is very reversible. I like to be able to reverse what I did, and it's just, I think, the best solution if it's available. Now let's go on to the next and last way you can tune your car. And now we come here to the Subaru WRX. This is a 2002 Subaru WRX, or should I say Impreza WRX, and this has been tuned with a piggyback tuner. Now, as I was explaining before, how does a piggyback tuner work? Well, first you have to know how a regular ECU works. So an ECU, or the electronic control unit of an engine, works by reading off sensors in the car. Now there's different, there's a MAF sensor, there's an O2 sensor, there's turbo pressure. A lot of different parameters can go into an ECU, and the ECU has some programming in there that will tell it, okay, if this happens, then do this. Now, of course, I'm I'm simplifying the way it actually works. It's a lot more complex than what I just explained, but now that you understand the basics of how an ECU works, you can understand how a piggyback unit works. So a piggyback unit plugs into all of those sensors before they hit the ECU. So all of those sensors get read by the piggyback unit, and then the piggyback unit tells the ECU different stories. So while the engine is doing something, the ECU thinks it's doing something else. So this allows the piggyback unit to actually get more boost, it can get more fuel, and it can go, basically work around the ECU, the stock ECU, and trick the stock ECU into giving it more power. Now the reason I don't like this is because I've seen a lot of dyno graphs with these piggyback ECUs, and it's first of all very difficult to fine tune them. If you take a look at the AFE scorcher for the Civic Type R, you'll see a lot of different spikes, and what those spikes are telling me is that the ECU for the Type R is actually fighting the piggyback. It knows something is wrong and it kind of fights it. Now it's not wrong enough, I guess, to throw a code, not always anyway, but it's something that I just don't like because you're tricking the ECU into trying to get more power, and sometimes things can go wrong. Now I know that the 335D also has a piggyback unit. I believe it's called JB4 or JBD, and that works basically by tricking the ECU, the stock ECU on the 335D. It tricks it by thinking there's not enough fuel, so more fuel gets dumped, and that's a pretty much very easy way to get power out of a diesel engine. But in gasoline engines, it's a lot more nuanced than that. You need to have the right AFR, you need to have the right readings from the O2 sensor, the primary one at least, and you need to have the right reading from the MAF sensor. You need to know what turbo pressures you're running. You got to be very careful with pre-detonation and things like that. So like I said, not the best tune, but with all of that said, this has had that piggyback tune for over 250,000 miles, and this car is still on its original clutch, on its original engine, original transmission, even its original turbo. Isn't that surprising? So while I may not be a big fan of the piggyback tunes, here's an example of it working, and it working beautifully. So there you have it, guys. I hope I was able to answer your questions with the different types of tunes. I prefer a reflash if it's at all possible. The other types of tunes just aren't my cup of tea. If they are for you, that's not a big deal. This is just my opinion, really. You see this WRX right here has 277,000 miles with that piggyback tune, and not an issue. I've seen the Type R run with the piggyback tune. Not that I like the dyno tune on it. I don't like the dyno graph on it. It's very spiky, but it'll probably run no problems either. This has run with piggyback tunes. It currently has a reflash. So there's many different options for you. I just prefer a reflash if possible. Second option I would prefer is that Motec, that standalone ECU, because you could easily tune it. Anyway, that pretty much wraps it up, guys. Thanks for watching. As always, I'll catch you guys next time. Peace out.